Hey guys, and welcome to another episode of Robostoph's Fireside Book Chat. For those of you who are unaware, Robostoph's Fireside Book Chat is simply a cozy book discussion series where we sit around a nice fire and talk about some of my favorite books. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Harlan Ellison's Boy and His Dog. Alright, so the reason I read this book is because I just finished The Road by Cormac McCarthy, and a lot of people said that he ripped off Harlan Ellison. I'm not going to get into that because I didn't find enough similarities between these two bodies of work to warrant that discussion. But I have read other things by Harlan Ellison as well, like I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, so my interest in this story was piqued. Alright, before I jump in, this book is a pretty controversial one. It deals with topics like rape and gang violence and things of that nature. So just be aware of that going into the summary here. Alright, to summarize this one, you have a boy and his dog who live in a post-apocalyptic world, and I think it's after like World War IV. And the boy and his dog have a telepathic connection with one another, and the dog is highly intelligent. When we're introduced to these two characters, the boy is trying to use his dog to sniff out chicks and get laid. And he finds an unsuspecting woman in a porno movie theater of all places that is like neutral territory of sorts. So sort of protected from the gang activity in the upper portion of this world. The boy follows this girl out of this theater and basically proceeds to help himself to this helpless girl. However, he kind of starts to fall in love with the girl throughout the story and finds out, after following her, that she's actually from a different society that lives underground. This underground society actually more closely resembles our own more civilized society of today. We find out that this girl was sent to lure this boy to this underworld because the people who live in this underworld are infertile. Problem is, when this boy gets to this underground society, they're not prepared for a man like him, who comes from a very brutal world on the surface. He speaks foul language, he does bad things, he's a bad fucking dude, right? The boy convinces the girl to ditch this society and leave it behind and take their chances on the surface world. So they have to escape. They commit a lot of violent acts on the way out, like Bonnie and Clyde, and it's hyper violent. But when the boy returns to the surface world, he reunites with the dog that he left behind. I'm not going to spoil the ending for you, but it doesn't turn out to be the Bonnie and Clyde love story that you would think. There are two particular themes that I want to focus on while we're talking about this one tonight. One, the importance of brutality, and second, why is Harlan Ellison such a controversial writer, and why is this such a controversial story? So I've read other works by Harlan Ellison, like I Have No Mouth and I Must Scream, and this book, A Boy and His Dog, and both of them are heavily criticized for being sexist. One thing I want to point out, I haven't done a whole lot of research on Harlan Ellison, the man, so I don't know that he, as a person, was sexist. In terms of the criticism, in both of these books, I sometimes feel that that was the point he was trying to make. He was trying to make a sexist, unlikable character. And I believe that it is important for us as the audience to sometimes remember that we have to separate the author from his work, and that people who we find disagreeable do exist in our world. We face them every day. So just because these themes are present in his books, I'm not sure that that should make us think any less of him as a writer, because he is forcing us to face a very important reality, which is that there are people like this out there and that these things do happen. I guess what gets people confused or angry is that these are the main characters of his stories sometimes. So the question then becomes, is he glorifying this behavior? Is he glorifying these types of people? And I would say not necessarily, because his stories are a little bit more nuanced than that. And that is what brings me to my next discussion topic, which is the importance of brutality. Because if I could compare this story to anything, I would say I would compare it to Demolition Man with Sylvester Stallone. It's one of my all-time favorite movies. I've watched it like 1,000 times. And in this story, you have an old school kind of guy from the 90s, right, who wakes up in the future, And in the future, the world is super PC, ultra polite, and there's no toughness, there's no grit. And when an old school criminal from Sylvester Stallone's time wakes up in the same time period, society isn't prepared for him. They can't stop him because he's such a savage. That theme is also present here in A Boy and His Dog, where we have an old school bad man who the civilized society just isn't prepared to face. Say hello to my ducks. So that got me thinking, though, about the importance of brutality, right? Um, as we evolve as a society, um, we live in times that become perpetually softer, right? Where, in my opinion, being offended is a privilege, right? Because it means you're upset or bothered by something that you don't necessarily have to face directly. I'm offended by it. Um, and being offended is somewhat of a weak stance, and people don't recognize that in themselves, that because they're offended or bothered, um, doesn't necessarily mean that they're moved to change anything, right? They're basically just being inconvenienced by her feelings. But it does highlight a situation that we may face as we continue down this path. Um, that what do we do when we are up against a force that is somewhat old school in nature, barbaric, and savage? Are we prepared to handle those types of people? And if not, what do we do? And do we have it within us to be those type of people once again? At what point is it necessary to break away from civility, if ever? I'm not sure. And in Demolition Man, it's obvious that society can't handle this issue. The police force can't handle this issue.
We're not trained to handle this kind of violence.
So they rely on another savage to equal the barbarity of Simon Phoenix. You don't get that in A Boy and His Dog. You don't get that equal opposing force because there is no hero in that story. But it makes you wonder, though. It makes you think: are we underprepared to face that type of adversity? Should we ever be faced with it? I oftentimes wonder this in my role as a parent. If I am raising my kids to be tough enough to face the challenges of the world. On one hand, I want them to be loving, compassionate, and kind. This is my primary focus. But on the other, I also want them to be prepared for what challenges lie ahead. And it is for this reason that A Boy and His Dog was so appealing to me, because it forces me to reconcile some of those thoughts about who we are and who do we want to be. I would not describe myself as a particularly tough person by any stretch of the imagination, despite the beard. Don't let it fool you. But I fantasize about being one, of course, like most guys do, right? That's like this built-in masculine trait, right? Where we picture ourselves up against hard times and we dream up ways of conquering those scenarios. Um, but seldomly do we ever face them how they're written in stories of fiction. And again, not only just within myself, but also thinking outwardly about the world we live in, and seeing it kind of grow softer and softer over time. At least it appears to. But that's the problem, right? Is it appears to grow softer and softer over time. But is it really? There are places and parts of the world that if you were to drop me in, I wouldn't survive not a moment. And I am well aware of that fact, because I am not built to survive in some of these situations that are ongoing even today. And again, this is why I say being offended is a privilege, because this is very much a reality for, you know, children who are built for war or overseas in other countries, or even right here in America, where they're raised in a hostile environment. Um, and yet, we like to pretend like we live in this happy-go-lucky world, right? Um, and I think this is what people really mean when they talk about checking your privilege. I am fortunate enough to be from a place and exist in a time where somebody else has already conquered those hardships for me, and I get to get a head start in life, because I don't have to worry about facing a world that deals with such brutality. Um, so I guess to answer my own question about preparing, my children for such a world, I don't know that preparation is the right thing to do. We could prepare for any number of scenarios. Um, just like Sarah Connor tried to prepare John Connor for Judgment Day, but oftentimes these things that we prepare for never actually come. So, in a sense, they might, and you'll have an edge for sure because you prepared for it. But if they don't, then is it a life wasted? And that is also a valuable question. So ultimately, I really enjoyed the story because it makes you wrestle with all these themes, right? It's not about making you like this main character who is arguably a piece of crap. Um, it's about making you face that inner turmoil within yourself about the brutal nature of the world and how well are you prepared for it. And if you had to face it, could you even survive a moment? For many of the characters in the story, the answer is no. They just get absolutely wiped out. It's freaking awesome. So for this reason, I would say that this story is an absolute 10 out of 10. It's one of my favorites right off the rip after reading it. I would highly recommend it. Over the Road. And if you haven't read it or listened to it, check out the version that is narrated by the author himself. It's absolutely a fantastic performance. Again, Harlan Ellison's A Boy and His Dog.